Hey everybody, now that I've taken you through the three roles of the media as they relate to a democratic society and sort of set up the expectation and value of a political media for a democratic society, I want to now do a romp through a couple of centuries of history of the American political media so that we can see what the media landscape has looked like that has led up to the current situation that we have now, as well as to see how well each of these different versions of the American political media lived up to the expectations for what the political media is going to do for a democratic society. I'm going to give you a couple of kind of teasers. One is that the next lecture that is going to talk about the current media environment, all of the prior stages of the American political media have kind of come back and exist in a different form in the current environment. So as I take you through each of these, I'm going to be talking about distant past starting in the 1700s. There are certain really important connections between what the political media looked like in the founding generation, what the political media looked like in the 19th century, what it looked like in the early 20th century, to things that are going on now. That's one of the characteristics of the current media environment, which is the topic of the next lecture, that we pretty much have the entire history of our political media wrapped up in one very fragmented, very diverse, highly competitive, extraordinarily tumultuous media environment of today. So as I go through this, each of these four stages, one of them replaced the other and kind of things died out, but they've come back in the 21st century media environment. The other teaser is that the three roles ideally played the four stages fall far short of fulfilling those roles. At each stage, up to the 21st century, the political media really didn't fulfill all of those roles, and even when it was consciously, as it came to do so in the middle of the 20th century, consciously fulfilling those three roles, there were still some severe limitations to how well those three roles were filled. The three roles that the media is supposed to play in a democratic society has never been the guiding principle for how the media does its work in society. I say it has never been. For most of this history that I'm going to take you through today, it was not. We'll get to the point where there was the self-conscious adopting of these three roles. But we start with the founding generation. The first era of American political media was the Partisan Era, which took place in the 1700s through about the 1830s, through about the time of Andrew Jackson. The founding generation knew about media, used media, participated in a media landscape, but did not specifically ever acknowledge the three roles that the media was supposed to play in a democratic society, even though they themselves fought the revolution to establish a democratic society in America, set up a democratic society with the Constitution, participated in the first decades of the actual political practice of a democratic society, and played democratic politics, often utilizing the media. They did not have an articulated, as a generation, and even individuals, very few individuals even did, have an articulated theory of media as it relates to democracy. So that all the things I said in the last lecture wasn't necessarily the things that the founding generation had articulated for themselves, thought of as ideas, or had said, well, these are important components. As I indicated, the First Amendment does contain freedom of the press, so there was certainly an important awareness that the political media played an important role in a democratic society, but there wasn't really this articulated notion that here are the three important roles, here's what they serve, here's why they need to be done well, here are the values that adhere to them, objectivity, openness and inclusion, and assertiveness. And in fact, the founding generation existed entirely within the partisan era. And what is the partisan media? The partisan media is media that expresses essentially ideological information and preferences. there is a sense in which what the media is doing in that era is facilitating the expression of personal opinions. It's really only the public forum, the facilitating debate role. That's what the press was mostly about during the partisan era. And of course, it was the expression of the personal opinions of not even just the elite members of society, right? Because first of all, the literacy rate in the United States was not very high during the founding generation. So very few people could actually read. Very few people had any kind of formal education that allowed them to have the critical thinking and synthesis skills necessary to take information and put it together. But the political media was in the hands of a very small group of people. And interestingly though, it was not in the hands of the wealthiest economic elites. The partisan era, the dominant producers of political media were what we could think of as artisanal printing press owners. Benjamin Franklin is probably the best known paragon of this kind of thing. He published Poor Richard's Almanac. He was a newspaper publisher. He published a lot of pamphlets. Basically, the political media was comprised of small-scale owners of printing presses who printed things up for relatively local distribution because the transportation infrastructure in the United States didn't really allow for a very wide distribution of any kind of publications. There was no other medium other than print. There was, of course, word of mouth, but that doesn't get very far, and that's not media. That's actually direct interaction between people. Pretty much the reading materials available to Americans were produced by local artisanal printing press owners. They were economic elites in the sense that they had enough money to own a printing press and had enough money to pay typesetters and to buy paper and to distribute their publications, but they were not at the top of the economic elites. The wealthier people, bankers and merchants and plantation owners, had almost nothing to do with the printing industry, with the political media industry. Bankers didn't own newspapers. Wealthy plantation owners didn't finance newspapers. Newspapers were largely in the hands of a kind of independently minded, very heavily opinionated, highly partisan in the sense that they preferred the ideas of one party versus the other. They weren't party hacks. They didn't belong to a party, or if they belonged to a party, they weren't owned and operated by the party leadership. That kind of press was coming in the next stage, but they were partisan and they leaned in one direction and they had opinions. Basically, what our original political media environment was comprised of a bunch of sort of upper middle class, artisanal printing press owners with strong opinions who were willing to use their ownership of these printing presses to express these opinions. And they did not necessarily expressly embrace the role of facilitating public debate, but that's what they were doing. They were themselves participating in public debate through the means of printing their opinions and printing the opinions of people who agreed with them. They were not at all people who felt like their job was to inform the citizenry so they could make good voting decisions. That's not what newspapers and pamphlets and publications, political publications of that era, were intended to do. They definitely had the impact of influencing voting citizens. And of course, the voting rights were limited to a very small group of people, largely people with property who mostly were literate enough at least to read these publications. But they were influencing the political discourse and trying to get people to vote in the way that they thought they should vote, but they were not themselves seeking to provide objective, reliable, useful information. So they were really just playing the public forum role. While they were playing it in a very vigorous way, societally, there was very little expression of different opinions. The opinions expressed in the partisan press era were largely the opinions of establishment, upper middle class white men. Now, it's not too surprising that it was white men, because that has been the dominant force in all of the eras of political media until the 21st century. But what is kind of surprising to a lot of people is that it was not the very wealthiest. It was not the most politically powerful. It was not the most culturally powerful. It were these upper middle class people who, like Benjamin Franklin, while he's extremely famous and he definitely was influential and he was a political elite as well, he was one of the few people who got to help write the U.S. Constitution. It was a lot of Benjamin Franklins who weren't ever very famous. One of the interesting things also about this era is that the partisan press wasn't a profitable enterprise, and it wasn't engaged in for profit. These artisanal printing press owners, they made a decent living. They were certainly not poor people, and they were not working class people. They were not struggling, but they were struggling in the sense that they didn't make large profits, and that wasn't even the purpose. And their other printing activities largely subsidized their political activities. They would print pamphlets, advertisements, broadsheets, essentially, flyers for private customers. They were kind of like the FedEx store of the early Republican period. They made a decent amount of money. They had a decent business, and they essentially subsidized their own opinionating through providing this kind of entrepreneurial printing business. They were not tremendously wealthy, tremendously culturally powerful, but they were the main contributor to the political discourse. They were the conduit. They were the gatekeepers to the kinds of opinions that were circulated, because there really was not another source. Now, at the time, because our political societies were much more close-knit, the public forum was actually much more a real, actual public forum. People in coffee shops, in pubs, in marketplaces, in church squares, actually getting together to argue about politics. So there was a lot less mediation of the political discourse during the early Republican period. There was a lot more face-to-face political debate. So the public forum role was really less important to be played by some mediating set of institutions. But there was also no media playing either of the other two roles, the information role or the checks and balances role, the transparency role. The next stage of the political media, American political media, overlaps slightly with, but more or less replaces the partisan press, and this is the party press era. And there's an important distinction here. The partisan press was the expression of opinions that were partisan. I prefer the Federalists, or I prefer the Democratic Republicans. I prefer this view of foreign policy. I prefer that view of foreign policy. The party press was a specific set of newspapers that were owned and operated and disseminated by the political parties themselves. Starting with Andrew Jackson, who, along with his right-hand man, Martin Van Buren, built the very first modern political party, the Democratic Party, built an entire party operation, what we would think of as grassroots organizations, county parties, offices, party slates, collective campaigning, fundraising. They built what modern parties do, and as part of that operation, they operated newspapers. And why? Well, because what they wanted to do was they wanted to generate and sustain support from voters. A political party is an institution whose primary intention is to win elections. And at the time, the voting rights were expanding much more widely, out from property-owning, educated white men to all white men. It didn't expand beyond white men until much later, but that was a pretty drastic expansion. At the same time, the literacy rate was also improving, and so more and more white men, whether poor or wealthy, knew how to read. And voting rights were being granted outside of property qualifications, so that by the 1840s, pretty much if you were a white man of whatever station in life, whether you could read or not, you could vote. Many of them actually had the ability to at least read. And political parties, in wanting to generate and sustain the support of as many voters as possible, were putting out their own information sources. Here's what you, the voters, need to know in order to make a good vote. Now, I'm going to air quote good because from the point of view of a party, a good vote is a vote for that party. So clearly what was going on with this transmission of information was not an objective presentation of information to the mass of white male voters, but a skewed, very party-oriented version of information. But it was information, and the parties themselves were self-consciously producing information to give to voters to get those voters to make decisions. So the role of information providing is now being embraced by the party press, party-subsidized and party-operated newspapers. But the information that you're getting is essentially party propaganda. Now, it's still information, and it still does help you make a decision. It's just not balanced. It doesn't give you an objective point of view. It doesn't actually help you make your own decision. It helps you make the decision that the party wants you to make. Now, I should note that there's competition here because the two major parties are competing with each other, so people have access to at least two different forms of competing propaganda. Propaganda is a common feature of human societies across the board. It's only truly dangerous when there's a monopoly on the production of propaganda, when one entity can control the flow of information. In a two-party system, while that might exclude a lot of other smaller parties and a lot of perspectives, and it certainly did, there's at least competing propaganda. And what that does is that actually makes the propaganda less truly manipulative. When you have a one-party system and when you have government-owned propaganda that excludes all other forms of information, that's when propaganda is truly utter manipulation and very dangerous. Not to say that propaganda of the party sort is great, but it is less bad than when there is a monopoly on the production of propaganda. This era lasts through the middle of, towards the end of the 19th century, and one of the reasons why this is the dominant form of political media is that printing presses are still expensive and unwieldy, transportation is still not so great, and it is relatively expensive to produce a newspaper, and there's really no profit in it because it's so expensive to do, and it can't be distributed very, very widely, and the inputs into it, the printing press, the typesetters, the paper itself, the people to go distribute it, it's going to not be a profit-making entity. Parties don't care about profit. They care about political victories. And one of the things that they'll do is they'll lose money on a newspaper in order to make sure that their propaganda, their our party information, gets to voters as effectively as possible. And so part of what parties do is they raise money through various sources and use that money to subsidize their party newspapers. Now, there is still a sense in which things are localized. Much like with the partisan press, there's not big national newspapers because the transportation is still such that it's very difficult to distribute things very widely, especially in mass quantities. But there is a nationalization of the political media in the sense that there are two major national parties, and they operate these kind of hierarchical structures where there's the national party and the state parties and then the local parties. Newspapers are run and subsidized by the local parties, but because there's an integrated national system of two parties, essentially there are two streams of party propaganda. Now, that begins to transform in the late 19th century, and there's an overlap period here. Basically, the party press more or less kills the partisan press, but there's an overlap between the party press era and the profit-oriented era, which comes next, because the parties don't actually lose their incentive to subsidize newspapers immediately upon newspapers becoming profitable. But what ushers in the new era is that improvements in particularly transportation and production and communication make it possible now for a newspaper to be a profitable enterprise. Much like the development in many industries throughout the 19th century in the United States makes certain things which were either minimally profitable or not profitable at all now extraordinarily profitable. Particularly the transportation revolution makes it profitable because now you can actually create a newspaper, and that's costly, but then you can distribute it widely enough that you can water down those sunk costs over many specific newspapers that get sent out into a larger territory. So basically what happens is newspapers become potentially profitable, and business people get interested because business people are in business to make a profit. Parties are in business to win votes. Business people are in business to make a profit. Newspapers become profitable. Now, the old party newspapers that are essentially propaganda are subsidized, and so they're either free or very cheap, and so people can get them into their hands. When you're trying to make money from a product, you have to make it alluring to people, and you have to charge enough that you can make a profit. Luckily now, you can actually charge very little to make a profit, but you still have to make it alluring for people to buy it. And this is where the new role of the political media begins to push in very quickly. And that role is to sensationalize political news, to make it exciting. Because the old party newspapers, they're basically propaganda. They're not very exciting. They might outrage you, they might lie to you and point out to you what the Republicans are doing, what the Democrats are doing that makes you mad. And there's a certain sense in which they are sensationalized, but they're propaganda, and propaganda is fundamentally unexciting. The new profit-oriented press, sometimes referred to as yellow journalism, sensationalism, that is oriented towards excitement, essentially entertainment. Now, what entertains people? There's a lot of things that go into these newspapers. It's not just political coverage. There's sports news, and in fact, the sports industries are made from sort of local games things into the larger kinds of national endeavors that we now know, also because of the rise of profit-oriented newspapers. So these profit-oriented newspapers had transformative effects on a broad set of areas of our society, not just our political society. But in politics, what gets people is corruption, crime, scandal. So those are the sensational things. And so what the profit-oriented media is producing most of in terms of political coverage are scandals, corruption, things that are exciting and outrageous and that make people mad. And this is where we get the era of muckrakers, who are yellow journalists who go and find problems. And sometimes they're social problems, sometimes they're corruption and bribery. But what they do is they actually begin, not because of democratic theory, not because they're like, oh, the political media needs to be checking the power of the government and preventing tyranny and corruption and ineffectiveness. They're just like, corruption and bribery and scandals and sex, these things all sell newspapers. And the public officials are engaging in all kinds of scandalous, sensationalizable behavior. And even if they're not, we can make stuff up that will allure and outrage readers. But what does happen is that the ensuring transparency role begins to be played by the political media, not because of the requirements of a democratic society, but because of the imperatives of a profit-making capitalist media system. Obviously, this is a good thing, but not a great thing. It's good because now public officials are actually being scrutinized and by outsiders, not just by the opposition party who's producing propaganda to make the opposite party look bad, and then it's pretty obvious that's just propaganda. They're doing it to sell newspapers and magazines, and later on to get advertising for radio shows. So it is a good thing because it's happening now in a way that it wasn't happening before, but it's obviously highly selective, and it is not, because it's not oriented towards actually playing the role of checking the power of the government. It only sporadically checks the power of the government, and it only does so in the most sensationalized and highly selective kinds of ways. Now, what ends up happening that transitions from the profit-oriented to the public service-oriented media. And I sometimes refer to that as the golden age of political media, because the public service-oriented era is when the political media, one, self-consciously adopts the three roles of the media in a democratic society, that recognizes that there are these three roles: informative, debate, and transparency, that the political media should be performing. And two, recognizes those core values that go along with each of those roles, objectivity, openness and inclusion, and assertiveness. And the journalistic profession adopts a set of professional ethics and a sort of professional approach that centers around public service, fulfilling those three roles, and adhering to those connected values. And I call it the golden age because the political media has decided to adopt the requirements of democratic theory for what role a media plays. This doesn't start happening until the 1920s. And one of the reasons it doesn't start happening until the 1920s is because up until the 1920s, there is no group of journalists who are professionals. One of the dynamics that occurs in American society as a whole, starting with the beginning of the 20th century, is the professionalization of what we now think of as the professions. Doctors, lawyers, dentists, journalists, pharmacists, accountants, engineers. These jobs were all done prior to the 20th century, but they were not done with any sense of professional ethics, professional mission, best practices. There were not licensing and training specifically for these people. You could be a lawyer just by essentially apprenticing with a lawyer, and then what you got was that lawyer's perspective on the law. There wasn't the American Bar Association. There wasn't the bar exam that you had to pass in order to be able to practice law in a particular state. There wasn't a professional code of ethics. There wasn't a systematized legal education. Same thing was true for doctors. There were medical schools, but there was no American Medical Association. There were no medical board exams. There was no curriculum that was taught to all doctors. So doctors, lawyers, accountants, engineers, journalists were essentially people who did jobs, but they weren't a profession in the sense of this established group of people with ethics, best practices, licensing, and education systems. Journalism joins the movement of pharmacists, accountants, doctors and lawyers were really first, and then quickly follows journalists, accountants, journalists, engineers, nurses. The professionalization of the American workforce is a very important transformation in the 20th century, and it gives us, among many other things, it gives us a class of professional journalists. During the yellow journalism era, journalists were basically just fiction writers who used a little bit of nonfiction, and they didn't require any kind of education, and they were often a very, hard-drinking, bootstraps kind of group. By the 1920s and definitely by the 1930s, journalists are college-educated professionals. Now, a lot of them are, came from humble backgrounds because it was truly, it was a meritocracy. If you could be objective, if you could write well, if you could do the job and stay up to late hours and do all this stuff, you could be a professional journalist. Part of what happens in all of the professions in America is that they develop a set of, as I say, a code of ethics and a set of best practices, and the journalistic profession develops what democratic theory requires of the political media as its set of professional ethics and its best practices. The other thing that happens is that there are the media companies that own newspapers and own radio stations and then later on own television stations. They also adopt this notion that the political news is not a profit-making entity. It is itself a public service. So these corporations adopt this progressive era public service ethic that, okay, I own a big newspaper, my job is not just to make a profit off of that and to sell it to whoever the hell will buy it, but to actually serve the public. And to do that, one of the things to do was to subsidize the news division. The news division didn't need to make money. In fact, it could lose money. And it could lose money because self-consciously and effectively doing those three jobs and doing it objectively and openly with assertiveness and inclusion was expensive. The rest of the media company subsidized by making a bigger profit. Sports pages, lifestyle, business, they all made the money that allowed the news division to not make the money. There also later on became licensing requirements for radio and television broadcast that required broadcasters to actually, that was legal requirement, to actually play this public service role and provide and fulfill these roles. So what went initially from a kind of a self-imposed set of professional and corporate ethics around broadcast became legally required. In any case, what we get is a media that is not profit-oriented, not tied to parties, not just the opinions of a small group of printing press owning people, but a mainstream media that has national reach, has resources, it doesn't have to make a profit, it has professional ethics, it has training, and it's fulfilling these roles. That's the golden age. And it's not such a great golden age, and I actually started teaching political science in this golden age. I started teaching in the early 90s, and there were plenty of critiques of the so-called golden age. Like now we can look back on it and go, oh, that was a golden age, when actually if you open the newspaper, you could rely on the stuff in it being true and having been vetted and being objective, and you could tell the difference between facts and opinions because opinions were expressed in a specifically opinion section and the rest of the newspaper was explicitly given over to facts. It was a golden age, but it had its limitations, and probably the biggest limitation was the narrowness of perspective. This was, for most of the 20th century, a completely white male, college-educated, dominated world. And so that narrow perspective, which is actually a very establishment perspective, right? It's establishment racially, white. It's establishment gender, so it supports the patriarchy. It's establishment in terms of the official culture, because these are all educated people who have a stake in the status quo remaining the way it is. So what we get is an establishment narrow perspective from the mainstream media. That's the main limitation, right? All three of the roles are being self-consciously played with a set of ethics and best practices that are drawn essentially from democratic theories, ideas about what the political media is supposed to do, but there's not this broad perspective that would make all of those three roles fulfilled at their more optimal place. You get information from college-educated white men who, what do they care about? They care about certain things, but they don't care about everything else. And they only can tell stories from the perspective of a college-educated white man. They can't tell stories from a non-college-educated black woman's perspective. And so they're college-educated, so they have a stake in mainstream society. They're not from the fringes, typically. They're not extremists. They're typically moderate, and they have connections and ties with the government. So the limitations on those three roles are that we have a very public service oriented approach, but a narrow perspective. Now, that's my roughly half-hour romp through 200 plus years of American political media. And what I hope you get from this is a few things. One is to see how changes in technology and society and the economy have driven transformations in the American political media. That's definitely true today. All of those things have driven the transformations that have created the current media environment. But I just want you to know that that's always been the case. But also so that you can see that the American political media, there isn't some kind of beautiful golden age. Like the founding generation didn't have a great political media. In fact, they had a worse political media than we had in the 80s. It was much more conflictual. There was a lot of name calling. Pick up a newspaper from the 1790s. You can't pick it up. Look up a newspaper from the 1790s. You're not going to see something like the New York Times from the 1960s. You're going to see much more like something from a totally partisan blog from the 21st century. But part of it is I want you to see that through most of American history, the political media didn't fulfill the three roles. It fulfilled one of the three, and it fulfilled it poorly. And it wasn't until the 20th century that the three were filled, and they were filled, I won't say poorly, but definitely suboptimally. So part of that is to give us context for evaluating the current media environment. Because it can be very easy when evaluating the current day to think back to some kind of mythologized past and compare the ugly, messy present to the mythologized past, and the ugly present is always going to fall short of the mythologized past. So I'm hoping that what I've done is given you a demythologized past so that we can have a more realistic assessment of the current environment. And also, as I said at the beginning, I want you to see, when I, in the next lecture, turn towards the different facets of our current media landscape, you can see that essentially each of these departed eras is back. And of course, the public service-oriented media is still around. It's just now it is no longer the dominant one. It is one of 4 different types of media that we have existing at the same moment. So I won't say anything more about that because that's the subject of the next lecture.